Hi, I'm Helaine Olen. I'm an opinion writer for the Washington Post, and I am moderating and handling this panel, Morality and Technology Futures, Trust, Privacy, and Truth Decay. And the way this is going to work is I'm going to introduce the panels. Panelists are going to speak for a moment or two. We'll open up, I'll have some questions, they'll have some questions for each other, and then I'll open it up to you guys to ask questions as well. So what I will say is technology has eliminated and reduced the power of gatekeeping, which is both a blessing and a curse. We could shop for anything we want. We can get any bit of information we want. We think. But the data is all being mined constantly. Our privacy is all but non-existent, and that information is not only truthful, but often keeps us in a bubble much worse than any suburban house. We hear what we want to hear. And this is obviously causing no small amount of problems for our societies. Moreover, as these sites gobbled up ad revenue, they took out vital news supports, compounding the impact of all of this. The platforms refuse to view themselves as publishers, which allows fake news and information to flourish. So does their refusal to invest in adequate moderation, which would cost the business model. But that's not how they put it. They talk about free speech, and I'm talking about Mark Zuckerberg here specifically, and no small amount of sometimes what could sound to outsiders like me, libertarian gobbledygook. That can seem designed to make it sound like what's in our best short-term interests of these companies is in all our best interests. So what's next? As the description for this panel puts it, how do we deal with the issues of media regulation, trust, and data privacy moving forward in order to stem the correct trend towards truth decay, the current trend towards truth decay globally? What are the steps required to reverse the trajectory, correct course, and set a path for a more sustainable information ecosystem? We're going to try to answer all of those questions over the next hour. And so we're going to start with 2-minute statements. And Josh Tucker, who is the co-director of NYU Political Participation and Social Media Lab, I'm going to start with you.
Great, thanks so much. So what I'd like to have as the takeaway from these opening remarks is that there's a serious trade-off between the topics of this panel. If we want to get at truth, if we want to have trust, and if we want to have privacy. It's a real trade-off, and it's something that we need to take seriously. So we're living in an era of increasing concerns about digital privacy, which is an excellent development, of course. Privacy is good. However, it's not a costless good. And I think it's crucial that we begin to move away from a simple kind of normative formulation where more privacy is unambiguously better. So why is this the case? Well, let's consider the case of social media. If you think about the data collection that Facebook has put together, right, the entire sort of Facebook data set at this point, it is undoubtedly the single greatest collection of data that's ever been assembled for analyzing human behavior in the history of the world. This is across cultures, across countries, across socioeconomic status, across age, whatever you want to do. We're talking about over 2 billion people. And the only thing better for trying to understand human behavior would be Facebook's data in conjunction with data from other social media platforms. When we talk about data privacy in terms of social media data, this doesn't mean that social media data is not going to be analyzed. It doesn't mean that social media data is not going to be analyzed and mined for insight. What it means is that the only people, if we begin to push the data back inside the companies, what it means is that the only people who are going to get any insights from this data are going to be people who work for the companies themselves. That means the insights that are gleaned from the sort of greatest collection of data ever for understanding human behavior are going to be put to the goals of these giant, large, multinational corporations, or more or less to maximizing ad revenue. That means the data is not going to be used to figure out how to prevent depression, how to improve disaster relief, how to track threats to public health, or even to attempt to understand the effects of social media itself on democracy and electoral integrity. Thus, data privacy is not without costs. There are serious costs in terms of foregone research efforts, in terms of foregone potential for scientific advancement, when we begin to push all of this data back inside the companies. So what's to be done? Well, first and foremost, we need to conceptualize data privacy concerns as a trade-off between, and I want to be totally clear about this, what I think are very real and very legitimate privacy concerns versus the foregone opportunities for scientific advancement it comes from limiting access to this data to people who work at platforms. So as a start, that might mean not reflexively opposing attempts to make digital trace data available for scholarly analysis. But we can push this farther, right? We can begin to think more seriously about what it means to own data in the digital age, right? Maybe we begin to need to think this more in terms of something like patents, right? The platforms have put out this incredible product that people get value out of, that people want to use, and in return for that, they get access to that data, but not exclusive access to that data. Maybe society has a right to that access to that data as well. We may want to think about more radical ideas like a data tax, right? We already live in a world where we allow for the fact that companies have to give some of their money that they make back to society because they benefit from the fact that society provides roads and police forces and armies and courts. And that's called taxes, right? We return money to the state all the time. Perhaps we need to begin to think about companies providing data back to society as well, companies above a certain amount of size, that just like some of their revenue has to be returned for the public good, realizing that these companies benefit from states, some of the data may have to as well. Ultimately, we may need to think about whether social media is so central to understanding how society begins to function today that public access to that data is going to be necessary for a fully functioning understanding of society. If so, we may even want to think about whether or not the state has an obligation to guarantee access to this data for scholarly research. Now, you may note throughout these brief remarks that I've stressed research and scholarly analysis. And to be clear, I'm not saying that data should just be taken and placed online and made public for anybody who wants to get access to it. Again, it's a trade-off. But it's not by access that I've mentioned scholars here, and it's because I believe that academics have a special role to play in this process. Because unlike many of the other actors in society, academics are rewarded, the currency of academia is publications. And that means putting their findings into the public domain. And if we want the gains that are possible to accrue to science from these data to be put into the public domain, then perhaps professional academics and scholarship is one of our best hopes in this regard. And I think the urgency with which we need to do this is increasing every day. Facebook is now hiring social scientists like it's going out of style. I know, because some of them are my best students, right, who are working there now. But this means that we're rapidly getting into a world where the largest research teams, the largest departments of social scientists, are going to be located inside social media platforms. They're going to have access to the best possible data for doing social science analysis. And yet, the research that they write, they're going to carry out research, they're going to write papers, but that's only going to be made available to people who exist within those companies. And so as a society, we're going to see increasing knowledge slippage over time. So thanks very much for the chance to make these opening remarks, and I think this is something we want to sort of keep in mind as we structure this discussion about privacy.
Okay, Chris, you're the Executive Director of Technology and Policy. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks for having me. So just to give a little bit of framing, my team spends most of its time in the space between people changing the world with new technologies and people trying to build the policies and regulation in order to respond. And when we look at this in this debate, much as you said, the thing that strikes me is that it's a world of complicated, multidimensional trade-offs. And it's often the case that politicians want to paint this in far more of a black and white set of choices, which doesn't really do the debate a lot of service. So just to kind of give you a kind of short overview of where we've come to on this, it seems that when you look at the economics behind a lot of these new technologies and the large companies in Silicon Valley, for better or worse, many of these markets seem to tend towards large companies. And the reality is that these companies have enormous power, but they don't always wield that power with a tremendous degree of deftness, right? They can often be pretty clumsy about it. And so for us, the question really boils down to one of legitimacy, that to all intents and purposes, like decisions are made on many of these platforms about the balance between different competing priorities. But the rules that guide that are established in boardrooms with very little democratic input or oversight. So the way through has to be a refreshed approach to the way we regulate these companies and the space more broadly. And we can go into this in detail in the conversation, but for me, this has to have 3 parts. First of all, we've got to have better, clearer way for companies to understand what's expected of them by society, from governments, from citizens, from civil society and others. What's the mechanism that's going to check and provide some oversight for the community standards or the terms and conditions or whatever a particular company calls their framework. The second has got to be better understanding for consumers in this space, right? Like all of us use many of these platforms. Nobody clearly has ever read the full details of the terms and conditions. Some of us have a sense of what's happening, many of us don't. You ask the public and there's this kind of creeping suspicion that somebody is taking advantage of them, but we can't quite put our finger on exactly what is happening. And there have been mechanisms put in place in other markets to try to give consumers a better handle on what's happening. And then the third thing, which I think is really important, is we need to be much more forward-looking in how we set up the whole environment, right? So there are bits of legislation in different countries which, frankly, are a constraint on progress and us doing things in a more sensible way, including companies, taking steps to be more proactive. And there are other arenas where maybe we should have been firmer in terms of applying areas of public policy like competition law to these sorts of markets. So look, none of that is particularly easy for politicians to grapple with, right? It's a difficult set of trade-offs to balance, and until we have an honest conversation in society about what it is we really care about and how we want to make those trade-offs, then I think we're going to struggle. But having said that, I'm an optimist. I think it can be done with the right leadership.
Okay. And John Paul Farmer, Chief Technology Officer, New York City.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for having me here. So I've been the Chief Technology Officer of New York City for about 4.5 months now. And a lot of people, including some of my fellow panelists, like to ask me, what the heck does that mean? What do you do every day? And I put it like this. So the city has long had an IT department that obviously keeps things running, keeps networks up, really important work. That's what the CIO does, the Chief Information Officer. The Chief Technology Officer role was created in recent years to look ahead, to look at how technology is changing our world, could be used to change our world in positive ways. And when I say look ahead and look to the future, I mean the near future. So it could be 3 months out, or it could be 3 years or even 3 decades out. So it's a broad mandate. And so we do this in collaboration with the various agencies that have responsibilities for delivering services, for protecting rights, and the like. And I'm going to focus on one particular piece of the title of this panel, which is trust. And if you've seen any of the Pew research over the recent years, you might know that in the 1960s, trust in institutions in the United States was 77%. That's now something like 13 or 15% these days. Doesn't seem to be getting better. And it didn't just happen. It didn't just happen in recent years. That happened over decades. But the question is, how do we recover? How do we recover trust? How do we create trust, especially in this environment where people seem so polarized, where there's so much disinformation and distrust out there? And there are 3 things that we are very focused on. And I should say, actually, before I even get into those 3 things, all the work that we're doing is aligned with the mayor's vision for the city. So the mayor's vision for the city is to make sure that New York City is the fairest big city in America. Fairest. So equity is at the core of that. And so the 3 things that we're very focused on that I'm going to mention here today are the digital divide, which you just heard about on a prior panel. Very important. Digital rights, these human rights online, ensuring that we are protecting them. And in order to have digital rights, you have to have digital inclusion. That's the 3rd thing. So very focused on not just giving people access to the technology, but including people in this process, co-designing solutions with them. So that inclusion angle. I'll talk more about these in specifics as we continue on this panel, but I just wanted to lay those 3 out: digital divide, digital rights, digital inclusion.
Okay, and last, Stephen Piekarczyk, right? CEO and co-founder of Sigma AI, which is anti-truth decay.
COO, actually.
Okay, sorry about that.
And
Thank you.
I want to thank you all for having me, Darren and Global Dream Forum. So I heard a lot about the issue that you've got institutions that are no longer trusted, and as a result of them not being trusted, people don't necessarily feel that they can trust the future technologies to be able to access their data and in turn be able to create convenience. It really does come down to data being used between those that use it. It's convenient, it's efficient. Those that prohibit its use or don't want to engage are the ones that are actually falling behind. And also in a lot of different ways, it's the ability to engage with that data. That's the limiting factor of AI being successful. So at Sigma, what we do is two sides of the business. One, which is the very important data preparation side. So that's the data tagging aspect of it, which humans up until this, probably, let's say the next 3 to 4 years, maybe 5, are still going to be far superior to those that in a semi-automated system to tag that data. And so as a result, you're having humans review data on other humans, which creates a little bit of a privacy issue, to say the least. And with that, I think is the need to be able to be upfront and transparent with users. And I think a lot of what's gone on now is that people don't understand how artificial intelligence works. They don't understand how their data is used to train artificial intelligence. And that creates that lack of trust. And also, of course, people feel violated in terms of their privacy. With that, I'll go into the truth decay part of the discussion. And, because of the fact that people have access to all this information now, and you've really, the whole editorial aspect of screening information and ensuring references and the quality of information out there, that's all very much been compromised in a lot of different ways. And it's because, to a certain extent, of this, what I call the data industrial complex. And you've got a certain number of portals that are out there that are controlling the vast majority of the information people see. And depending, of course, everybody's got their own opinion, but being able to publish online and being able, the ability to align with just about any fringe idea or any extreme out there is such that you've created real problems with truth, and of course that's where alternative facts come in. And I think what people start to look at is they're questioning just about everything in terms of what they read. But again, what they've if they've got reinforcing facts, or so they say, facts, alternative facts, into their idea of whatever their belief is, whatever their fringe is, be it, I was having discussions with somebody just the other month about the flat Earth and young millennial, and I couldn't believe it. It's very, he had a very well versed position as to why he thought that was the case, or another guy that has thought we hadn't gone to the moon yet. So why is this happening? And the reality is, I think we need to get to the core of being able to screen out information that is absolutely not true, but do so in such a way where you're not limiting people's Second Amendment rights. And of course, you saw that with Facebook most recently, with the fact that they're not screening out opinions of certain publications or opinion pieces that, even though they might hold a fringe idea, they are still an opinion piece. So the question is, how do you pivot from that? And how do you actually, have information that people can actually use, believe in, and you don't have this incredible tearing apart of the fabric of society that we have now, where people don't know. We've gotten to the point where everybody's in different camps, and we keep reinforcing each other with additional information. And a lot of that information is either only partially true or completely false. And so I think that that's one of the bigger challenges that you're going to hear from me here later on.
Okay. And thank you. And I just want to say I'm not checking my phone constantly. This is how I keep track of the time, everybody. So nobody's texting me. Stephen, I'm going to start with you because this is actually a really interesting point. Is how would you see a way to resolve the tension between freedom of speech on one hand, people's desire to find out what they want to find out about? I mean, in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with reading about flat Earth theory, right? And the platform's responsibility, and what kind of enforcement mechanism would you see needed for this? I mean, because leaving it to the individual platform has not exactly been the most successful strategy.
No, it has not, and that's the big challenge of how do you police this? And I think you look at the fact that you need to be able to develop tools, which we at Sigma are working on, but of course these tools have to ingest a tremendous amount of data to be able to tell you that, okay, this article is 92% true, referencing some other data. But again, you've got to have a tool that is unbiased, which is a very big challenge as we talk about biased data and what people think. But at the same time, people need to be critical thinkers, and I think a lot of that also has been lost over time, is because of all this information, people feel empowered. Prior to the internet, even in the first 10 years of the web, you had essentially a continuation of the same process that was going on for the last 100 years with journalism, and I think that's something that has changed dramatically in the last 10 years in particular, where everyone now has access to a variety of sources of information, and I think it's a matter of not only looking at the veracity or the accuracy of the information that someone is reading, but also the source of that information.
Okay, one quick
we
follow-up.
Lost that reference.
Okay. One quick follow-up question here, which is, you just talked about a tool. Who uses this tool? Do consumers use this tool, or do the platforms themselves use the tool to keep bad information off? I will say my own biases, as somebody who spent years in the financial literacy trenches, I don't think most consumers actually want to use the tool and see it themselves. I think people want to believe what they want to believe.
Right, and that's why you have a lot of content moderators now with a lot of these platforms, and they're actually going through and being able to sift through this. Again, it's a human function to a great extent. You can semi-automate the process, but at the end of the day, humans are best able to interpret these nuances of what actually is true or not.
But what humans? The platform humans, or the several billion people actually reading the content?
Well, that's the thing. The platform would be the ideal. The thing is, can the platforms police themselves?
Okay, and does somebody want to take this? I mean, how do we get the platforms to legislate to police themselves, or do we? Go ahead, Josh.
Thanks.
I was just going to go to you too. So
okay, that's great. So I want to jump in with a word of caution in this regard. The first thing is, if you hang out with people at Facebook enough, you will hear the phrase "arbiters of truth" over and over again, as in, we don't want to be arbiters of truth.
Right.
And obviously, that's a talking point that you hear from the platforms, and there's a lot of things that you can conveniently hide behind that phrase. But I think it's also a really, really serious concern here. Right? The same exact people who are calling for the platforms to become content moderators and to start pulling information off and deciding what's true or not, if I went up to you and said, hey, do you think ExxonMobil should be in charge of deciding what's legitimate news or not? You would say, no, I don't think so. Probably that's not a great idea, right? Facebook is a giant multinational corporation. And when we talk about turning over to Facebook the ability to delegate what is true and what is not true to pull it off, I think that's something that should give people a lot of caution. And let me give a couple reasons here. One is, even if you think about having a kind of arbitration process that's in place afterwards, your content's pulled down, you have the ability to appeal while you might do this, that it would be self-correcting. That gets into a huge question of resources, right? Who has the resources to mount appeals process? We've already seen this in terms of content moderation around things like hate speech and harassment and things like that people who are going to have more resources are the ones who are going to be able to appeal these things. So there's a danger that by empowering ways to demote content, empowering ways to have the platforms be responsible for removing content, you're going to reify existing power divides, because some people are going to have the ability to figure out how to deal with this and some people won't. And you end up with exactly the kind of communities for whom Facebook is the most kind of valuable organizing tool, are the ones who are most oppressed, who are at great risk of losing control over the process here. The second option is that we get into the problem with Facebook, of course, is that it's in almost every country in the world. And so we get into the question of, well, what is sort of cross-cultural aspects on this and cross-country aspects on this? And if you start getting into a situation where you're saying, perhaps very rightfully so, that we're going to have different definitions of what's appropriate, what's culturally appropriate in different countries and different places around the world, then all of a sudden you get into a situation where are you allowing states cross-globally to begin to define what's acceptable to be talking about online, right? Do you have a situation where Russia says, you know, anti-LGBT, anything that's pro-LGBT communities, that's something that's against our culture and we want you to be able to take that down? Or if you give states in the West, liberal democracies, the right to sort of regulate that content should be removed because it's truthful or not truthful, what does that mean in the context of more authoritarian regimes? Are you then handing over in the situation where you're creating an acceptable forum for authoritarian regimes to be able to make the same exact demands about, okay, we can tell you, we the state can tell you. So I think it's, in practice, we're all concerned about the sort of amount of information that's out here. But when you start to work through what all the possible solutions are, there are problems with all of these. And I think it's really important when we think, especially about Facebook, to not be thinking purely in the US context, right? What do we want that's best for the US? But to remember that these policies are going to be global, not just national.
Okay, so then I have a follow-up question. I want other people to jump in on this, which just begs the question of size and largeness, right? When we never, I don't want to say never, but back in the days before mass internet, mass social media, we had newspapers, we had television networks, right? So I'll use the United States as the example, since we are in the United States. We had the three major networks. Every town had about 2 to 3 newspapers, even post the television explosion. So if you didn't have one arbiter, right? So does this beg the question of having to break up Facebook, Google, you name it, right? So that people have a right of appeal, because you can't have a mass free-for-all under the theory of, well, they're just too big, and giving this much power to one private company is a problem, because yes, it is. I absolutely agree. But at the same time, I think the situation we're currently in is also, replete with problems. Do you want to go, Chris?
Yeah. So
okay.
let me go first. So I think look, you're absolutely right. Like, you can't have scale being an excuse for reckless behavior, right? Nobody should get a free pass just because you're at the point where you've got so much wealth and so much access that you think that you are invulnerable. But I would say the thing that's different now is the economics of the internet, and these sorts of businesses are quite unlike the sorts of large companies that we've seen in the past. And so an environment where you've got effectively very large fixed costs and to all intents and purposes zero marginal costs, which enables them to get so large and to roll up so much of a particular market. I think that's actually inherent in the nature of the technology. So for me, sure, you could have the conversation about how do we break them into whichever subsets of these companies. I strongly suspect that what happens is it's only a matter of time before they roll up again maybe in a slightly different configuration, but probably you still have the scale problem coming back unless you put much stronger controls in to prevent that. And then you collide into another question, which is, I'm now trading something different, right? I'm trading the value of some of these networks that now have fewer participants on them, which makes them inherently less useful to me as a user, against these other dimensions, which is why I come back to this point that I think you have to accept the scale, and then you have to figure out what is the right framework to wrap around it in order to align the way that they behave with the public interest. And it's this point that came up just now around we can't expect companies to do that on their own. And unless you construct something that involves government and civil society and others, then we'll all have our own personal views on what that should look like, and we will all cheer when they do something that aligns with our view, and we'll kind of, be an outcry when they do something that doesn't align with our worldview. But we never really resolve that underlying tension.
So what would you want to see done then? This all sounds great, but what's a good practical solution here?
So I think you need to convene, like a government and some kind of political system needs to step up and take some leadership responsibility for this, to say that we do have to regulate these companies, but that doesn't mean applying the rules and regulations of last century. You need to define the set of, you need to take all these issues, right, on privacy, on competition, on well-being, there's a whole long list of them, which are in tension with each other, and you need to have an honest conversation in society about, like, how do we balance them, right? How much do I care about, protecting personal data and locking it down versus the implications on competition, and so on and so on. And once you've done that, then you need a system where you have a regulator that knows what it's doing, and that, I think, means actually a different sort of organization with different sorts of people, right? Like, to take a financial services analogy, you hire people who've worked in banks to regulate banks, and we ought to be setting up a regulator to poach a ton of people out of Silicon Valley so they understand how these companies work and scrutinize them. And then you have powers of audit and inquiry so that you can hold the companies to account, that when they set their community standards or whatever else, that somebody can say to them, does this align with the settled view of how you want to balance this stuff? And if not, then there should be penalties for it.
Okay. I want to then go to John, because I have a quick question, which is one of the things we're starting to see is as we, Washington being Washington, and, we can go on, that could be a separate panel at this point, some of the states in the United States are starting to take action, California being one. How does this, free-for-all, what could essentially turn into a free-for-all with different states making different regulations about privacy, about data, about, stepping in on various other issues, how does that impact what you would be doing ultimately? How does this impact the companies that you're trying to encourage?
So it's a really good point about a patchwork of regulation that could arise. It really depends on what those regulations are. A lot of people expect that at some point there will be some federal rulemaking here, but it doesn't look like that's around the corner. So it looks like in the near future we're going to see this patchwork grow. California certainly early, but others considering it right now. I want to go back to some of the points that were already raised, though, because they're really interesting. On this very stage earlier this year, Fred Wilson, a renowned venture capitalist, and Tim Wu, a professor here at Columbia and a noted tech policy author over the years, had a debate about what should be done about large tech companies and the power that they have in society. And Tim was very much on the side of antitrust action. Fred didn't really opine on, this is my memory, so please don't, you should talk to them, but my memory of it is that Fred didn't necessarily say whether that was appropriate or not, but he didn't think it'd be effective, because to Chris's point, he thought there'd just be another roll-up that would take place in short order. So he was much more interested in something that Josh brought up earlier, which is the role of data. That because data is what entrenches certain companies and gives them power, if that were made available to the people about whom that data refers, if they could access it and then potentially port it to other competitors, that could allow startups, challengers, others with different business models that might be more amenable to someone's personal values, what they want to see, how they want their data to be used, that could actually change behaviors. And so a really interesting debate there. I also want to go back to something else that Josh brought up in his remarks. Lots of really interesting remarks there. You mentioned this term arbiter of truth, and the fact that social media companies might say, well, we don't want to be arbiters of truth. But other people might say, well, they're already arbiters of appropriateness, aren't they? They have content moderation. They decide what's appropriate for an audience here in the United States versus in, say, the Middle East or in Europe or in South America, and they might make different choices there. And so I guess I would ask the question of, do you think they're already arbiters of something, and is that appropriate?
So I think we do want to be careful about the distinction, and it's easy to fold them into each other when you're talking about content moderation around issues of harassment and issues of community standards versus this question of fake news or incorrect information that's being portrayed in a sort of newsworthy format. In both of these cases, though, I think a lot of these problems that we talked about here, which is that what happens when you give where do you give the power? Who's making the decisions is important in both of these cases. And then the question of what's the role of the state and how is the state getting involved in sort of setting these things cross-country becomes crucially important. So yes, the platforms are absolutely trying to deal with content moderation, but they're running into exactly the same sort of problems that we're going to run into on this question of being arbiters of truth, right? The same questions. Are there cross-cultural differences in this? That has to do with the sort of content moderation. And how do you apply the policies fairly? How do you apply the policies globally across countries? So yes, I think we can say that these are private companies, right? And that they have an obligation to their user base to think about this question of content moderation. But that becomes a separate question where you get into this question of who is going to decide whether or not something is factually correct or not, right? And if we give it to the platforms to do that, and we mandate that the platforms remove information, in short periods of time, in short order, most likely what's going to happen when the platforms are in these kind of legal consequences is they're going to err on the side of caution. They're going to err on taking more stuff down, right? Which then leads to this concern about who has the ability to sort of appeal this process in taking this out. So I think they're both.
I'll just say how they construct the appeals process then matters.
Right,
You
absolutely.
can have a lightweight appeals process that's relatively accessible and easy for people to use.
Right.
Or one that requires an army of lawyers and an entire team to focus on it.
But what we've seen for the most part here is that the way that they're dealing with this is they're dealing with it by dealing with how their sort of algorithm prioritizes information, right? So the question is not so much, are you taking things off? Right? Are you saying that this is going to actually be removed, both in terms of users, which is very infrequently, but also in terms of individual posts? But there's also a sort of in-between stance there, which is that the algorithm that shows how prevalent something is going to be showing up in your feed, right? There's a million things that feed into that algorithm, and the platforms are able to adjust that algorithm. And already Facebook has taken lots of steps to try to get the quality of news content as something that goes into that particular algorithm that's there. But I want to go back to the point I made at the beginning, which is that regardless of what is the method that's going to be used in these aspects, the only way we're going to know how this is playing out in reality is if we have access to data, if people outside of the companies have access to data to be able to assess how these things are functioning, right? We hear so much, for example, about the sort of rabbit hole function of the YouTube recommendation algorithm. But without access to that data, what we're limited to is sort of anecdotal observations, or even sort of systematic anecdotal observations of this, of trying to understand whether or not individuals have looked and gone through and can sort of document times where they go through the YouTube algorithm and it lends them towards extremism. But we don't know whether at scale this is actually a property that's happening. And I think it's the same question about if you're going to have content moderation, being able to understand the effects of that content moderation, that requires this kind of transparency in terms of data.
Okay, so a question for everybody then. How do you get that sort of data out while ensuring people's, privacy protections? I mean, one of the issues, there's two different issues here, right? First, I mean, we know that the platforms have often, when they have let academics in, it has not always been, there's the famous Facebook depression thing where they let people, they were manipulating moods. But second, it's also not always academic. I mean, the real data issues are not academic, not disinterested, so to speak, but often commercial, political. So how do you protect people in these situations? Anyone?
I think one of the things that can help solve this is, believe it or not, GDPR. So the ugly word hasn't been mentioned yet, but that's one of those things of implementation of a policy sometimes is much more painful than anyone can ever possibly expect. But one of the things about GDPR that's interesting, that's going to be quite a burden for many of these, call them data companies, is the right to forget. And so to be able to just be forgotten and my data is completely eliminated out of your database. If it's YouTube, if it's Google, I just ask, and that needs to happen. And it needs to be documented, and there needs to be a paper trail. So in that same respect, that should be able to lead you to potentially doing what Josh talked about, which was the portability of the data itself. And then ultimately, and we don't know what type of vehicle we'd see in this, but ultimately see some sort of marketplace.
Okay,
for
so
data, where you own your own data.
here's a question. I agree. I mean, but one question that's come up is in the right to privacy and the right to be forgotten. I think some of the platforms have said, well, okay, we'll enforce it in Europe, but we won't enforce it elsewhere. So that leads, well, then is it not being taken down in the United States? Or could conversely a platform say, okay, then we're going to ship all the data to fill in the blank country, and won't take it down there, and it's all still stored somewhere. So how do you deal with questions like this? Anybody?
I mean,
Did
I
I
mean,
come up with a question that nobody can answer?
No. I'll answer the question of how you protect privacy. The first thing I want to say is I want to channel Jeff Jarvis, who's not here right now, but if he was, he would respond by saying that as a journalist, he finds the right to be forgotten to be utterly offensive. Right, like it goes against the basic principles of journalism that things that happen in the public, that things that happen in the past are things that we should be recording, right? Not the things that we should be having forgotten.
Including in a public forum.
Including in a public forum, and where you sort of draw the line on that. But in answer to your question about how you protect privacy and allow this kind of analysis, and we can agree the analysis can be valuable for scientific advancement. We agree the analysis is absolutely necessary for regulation, and it's absolutely not necessary for policy evaluation along the way we're talking about, knowing if these things work or not. There's essentially kind of three ways you can try to guarantee privacy and make the data available. One is mathematically, and this is the rise of what's known as differential privacy, which essentially involves injecting noise into the data so that you can, enough noise into the data so that you can't ever tell if any individual was part of the data set. There are pros and cons. We could have a long conversation about differential privacy, but that's one way. There's a second model, which is the kind of safe harbor model, which is what the US Census has been doing, where you literally build kind of safe rooms. Now, these safe rooms can be physical, they can be virtual, but there are areas that you enter into that you guarantee the data cannot get out of, and you have to do all sorts of training to become a part of this, but you create these safe spaces where people can go in to conduct analysis on data. And the third is the way that we traditionally have done this, which is that we have binding legal agreements, right? And then to be utterly, utterly clear, right, like Cambridge Analytica was a huge, huge fail in this regard. But in a sense, it was a fail in a regard where there was less of an infrastructure around this. It was more Wild West in terms of what Facebook was giving out. But we have for years and years had conventions around how people do research with medical records data, right? And again, scholars and academics pay a price when they violate these things, right? There is a community out there that has to be able to enforce this price, but if you violate these standards, right, you will pay a price in terms of your reputation, your future access to grants, your future access to publications. So those are three methods we can do this. What it doesn't get at is the points that we're making before, which is that you can make a whole other case for this kind of data transparency and data portability from an economic standpoint. Right? There are arguments that I've seen economists made with theories about this. We're showing that, like, if Airbnb has enough of the data about people's purchasing and people's renting of housing, it becomes impossible for competitors to challenge Airbnb, which is a sort of net welfare loss for society, because then you have this kind of entrenched monopoly status. So you can make this argument that Airbnb should be making 1/10 of their data available to would-be competitors for the good of society, so that they can train alternative models on that data, much as along the way that companies are doing this. That runs into, I think, thornier problems, right? Which is, again, I think why we want to think of these in sort of different buckets. Where is the research being done that's being done sort of for pro-social or societal reasons? Where is the research that's being done for economic and business reasons? Not that one is better than the other, but I think they fall into different buckets there. But it's not something that's completely hopeless.
And just to add on top of that, I think you make some really good points about the moats that are created to protect businesses by simply the fact that they have data that nobody else has. On top of that, that's going to get to be an even bigger challenge with artificial intelligence and algorithms playing more and more roles in our lives, because when somebody has the data and someone else doesn't, it's impossible to compete. And so I think it's a really important question that we've got to address.
I want to open this up. We have about 10 minutes left, or between 15 minutes left. Does anybody have questions in the audience before we keep going? Go ahead. Mike.
Okay, I use the organizer's prerogative to ask some questions here. So fascinating stuff, and this panel could go on for about 2 or 3 hours, and I didn't think we'd finish or get anywhere close to finishing. Obviously, Darren Fogelman here, founder and CEO, Global Dream Forum. this concept of ownership of data or data, and the ability to actually have, for a consumer to have full transparency over what data is held where, and to actually truly own that, and to be able to use it as a commodity, in essence, to be able to select who has access to it when, if there's a price attached to it, for that price to be attributed, and for the consumer to earn from that. That seems to be a common thread here, that most actors agree that that is not a bad idea, and that is something which is a very interesting sort of democratization of data, and would be a very useful thing. Who is going to make that come about? Because the will may be there, but it doesn't seem that anyone is actually in place to do that. Now, that's one point. The second point I'd like to make, and this is really actually more for John as CTO of New York City, I'm interested, as you began at the start to classify where your role is and where it is. There is a CTO of, as you know, of the federal government, Michael Krasios, who will be joining us on a future panel, I'm sure. Just interested to get a sense for how the CTO role plays out on a federal, state, local level, its relevance, what impact you can have and you aspire to have from this role, and then how you collaborate internationally. I know you've got a lot of international collaboration going on around best practice. You take a lot of that, you try and bring it in, you cross-fertilize, etc. But that's something that the world doesn't yet have a full grasp on, and I think that's really fascinating to hear more on that. So the first question is for the whole audience, and I'll let Helaine allocate it accordingly. The second one, just for John.
Well, who wants to go first? Who wants to take? You want to take it, Chris?
Yeah, so just on the first of those, I think it is an interesting conversation, this question around data and portability and so on. I think I'd say a couple of things there. One, I think that it's straightforward, and a lot of people say, clearly we own our own data and therefore we should be able to access it. I think the reality is slightly more complicated, and you've got to draw a distinction between the data that I explicitly inject into a platform, the data that exists based on their observations of my behavior, the data that exists off the back of inferences built on the observations about my behavior. And I maybe own some of that at one end of the spectrum, and it's less obvious to me at the other end of the spectrum quite how much I own, or whether it's co-owned or what else. And I think you run into some other kind of interesting questions around, GDPR, right, to some extent has done a lot of this, right? I can, as a happy European sitting in Britain, I can push these buttons and download all my data sets. It's a little bit impenetrable when I do sometimes. But also, there are some things that I can't get, right? I can't actually bring my social graph out of one of these platforms because that also contains a bunch of other people's personal data. And yet it's the social graph that is probably the most important if you're thinking about constructing a competitive player to some of the big platforms. So I think we made some progress, but like all these things, I think it's more complicated than some of the kind of debate would have you think.
Do we have any sense of how many people in say Great Britain have actually pulled, to use one example, have actually pulled down their data? Are people interested in this, or?
So when GDPR first came in, there was a flurry of activity, and people were doing the data requests, and then hilariously, of course, posting on social media, here's my massive, the output of my data request, and then realizing they should have redacted the names of all the folders and so on. But like all these things, I think it's important. I think the principle is important. Then there's a question of how many people will actually go on to take it up. It's a bit like, I think, some of the open data debate that we had in government, over recent years, where certainly in the UK at one point there was this argument that if we just open up all the government's data, an army of armchair auditors will hold the state to account, and we'll make this tremendous progress. And the truth was, the army of armchair auditors was 3 people who were interested in, was a local city council paying too much for donuts? So there's something about the infrastructure, our digital capability, civil society's ability to interrogate this stuff that is also important in here.
Josh, does opening it up, make the companies handle it differently in some way, and how does that impact them?
Can I just want to two-finger on this question about that we were just saying a moment ago about how many people are going to download the data, how much of people. I think this is actually a very serious matter, that we have this divide between policymakers who think that people value data enormously and what we observe in practice in terms of how much people value data. versus how much people will say they value data if you ask them on a survey.
Right.
So for example,
agree.
we did a study, which some of you we did a study where we were doing a panel survey of people around the 2016 election, and we gave them the option to donate their Facebook data to the study, right? And so we asked them to sort of log into Facebook. We did this all with their consent. We did not pass the data along to anybody, but we asked them if they would do it, and we gave them a monetary incentive to do this. And we had no idea how many people would pick this up, but we thought this wasn't going to work at all. We thought maybe 5% of the people would give us their Facebook data. 50% of the people in our survey who had Facebook accounts were willing to give us the data.
For how much money? I'm sorry.
$5, right? That's what we gave them. It turns out, actually, when Matt Genskow and Hunt Alcott did their first sort of Facebook deprivation study, it costs $100 to get people to go off Facebook for a month. That's what you have to pay people to get them to leave Facebook for a month. And so I think this is a realistic question. I mean, you think about the CVS cards that we all carry around on our wallets. People are willing to tell people, what medical things they're spending on. Like, what are they buying at drugstores in order to get, $3 off of razors? So I do think this is an important question. We did a study, and going back to the very beginning where you talked about confidence in institutions, I was part of this team that did this 2018 U.S. institutional confidence poll. And what we found in this that was pretty interesting was that, well, there are a lot of things in it that were interesting, but one thing that was interesting was there was low levels of confidence in Facebook, and it was one of the few things that spanned across the political divide. Most of these institutions, it was based on whether you were a Republican or a Democrat. And there was high levels of confidence in Amazon, right? So I don't think it's that consumers are necessarily reflective about being uncomfortable about companies that are gathering a lot of data from them. I think it's more what they think those companies are doing with that when they have it. And Amazon, which is just bringing people goods to their house, right, as opposed to Facebook that had been through scandal versus scandal versus scandal. So I think we need to learn more about what it is how people actually value this and how people actually think about this. And I think we are in this world where there's this divide between there. To me, it's very interesting. Maybe I'd like to think that part of the reason people were willing to give us the data was because we were doing it for science, we were doing it for research. And I think go back to your original question that you actually asked me, like, how does this change things? I mean, we haven't seen any evidence that now that Facebook makes it available for people to download their data, that this is changing what people are doing. But it's a great question to ask in the future.
I'm dying to know one thing. Did you guys do a demographic analysis on who was willing to give up that data? Because it's one of those things that I look at as, if you look at e-commerce in 95, 96, .com one, call it, everybody thought it was going to change the world. And all the brick and mortar was going to go away. Well, that actually is happening now, a generation later. So is this a generational divide that you've got millennials or Generation Z that's out there that's willing to pretty much share their entire lives, and they don't particularly care the fact that it's all out there and the fact that it's going to be searchable 40 years from now, versus generation, our generation as well as baby boomers. It just seems that they're more willing to push on the brakes. What do you think about that?
So I'm very sympathetic to the argument. I haven't studied it, and I don't have the data to back it up, that there are significantly different conceptions around expectations around digital privacy from the younger generation, and I think it's a great subject for study. In our particular study, again, we were surprised, but we got a fairly representative sample of the population of our survey who was willing to donate the data, which made doing future analysis actually a lot easier with it.
Okay. Next. Sorry. Yes. John,
Got to answer my part.
Yes.
So
sorry.
first,
Thank you.
first of all, I'll point out that you're right. We can't call millennials the young people anymore. They're not so young.
They're 40.
Not so young. The other thing I'll say, just to add on to the conversation that's already been happening, is we've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. There's the data privacy issue, incredibly important. There's also the data poverty issue, which is incredibly important. And so we have to address both of those at the same time. And it's going to take everybody. It's going to take government, or a variety of governments actually, local, federal, collaborating with the private sector and academia and foundations all together. Because I don't see one sector solving the problem, and I don't see there being one silver bullet out there. And so to answer the question about how we interact with other levels of government, prior to this job, I worked in the White House in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and I worked under one of the prior chief technology officers, Todd Park. He was the second CTO of the United States. I was the senior advisor for innovation, and we worked together to create something called the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program. And so this was this idea to bring in entrepreneurs in residence, technologists, innovators into government agencies to apply proven best practices, proven at least in the quote-unquote startup community, but not really used in the public sector too much. And that worked really well. And that's grown here in the US federal government to 18F in the US Digital Service. And it's part of a larger global movement that involves the UK with Government Digital Service, has grown into a force there. Just last week, I had the CTO of Singapore in my office for a conversation about the work that's going on through GovTech, which is their organization. It's happening in Canada, where actually some of our former Presidential Innovation Fellows have gone to run the Ontario Digital Service and the Canadian Digital Service. So I've advised the French government on issues like this in the past. So it's happening in lots of different places, and that's great, because one, it's helping people in lots of different places get services, protect digital rights, but it also means that we here in New York, have this network that we can tap into for best practices. And so we're looking to bring that into local government here. The good news is some of it's already happening, but it's happening in pockets. And so I'm fortunate, working out of the mayor's office, to be able to bring what's happening in pockets, places like the planning department. Who here knew that the planning department here in New York City has NYC planning labs? One person, congratulations. All right, 2 people, and Julie up there on the video equipment. So a few people, but most don't. You have to be really into either planning or civic tech to know that. And that includes other agencies within government. So it's not just sharing from Singapore or from the UK, it's sharing from one New York City agency to another as well. And so there's a lot of good work out there, and I view part of my job as just uncovering best practices, finding people who are eager to apply them, and just making that connection.
Okay. This woman had a question in the back. Somebody wants to give her the mic? Yeah.
Oh, hi. I'm a scientist, actually. I'm working in City College. It's the first time I come to this kind of forum. And from your discussion, stimulate some thoughts about the database. Because what I see is that if we want to have data transparency and safe for all customers, for all people, one thing we can do is, that's my suggestion, based on scientific work. Okay, let me describe scientific work. How do we do it? For example, one gene bank. Every laboratory, you did a sequence, then you deposit it to gene bank. And then this gene bank is open to all scientists and the company. Company, when you use it, they need to pay some money. That's the way they do. Okay, so, but it is a government data bank. So what we can do is for this commercial, let's say Amazon, Facebook, whatever, they should deposit their data to government data bank. And then anybody want to use it, they have to pay for that. In addition to that.
Okay, and if you could just wrap in about 30 seconds, because we only have a couple of minutes left. Okay.
Data bank, government data bank, critical thing is data, the government has to do curate, to remove individual persons like a name, social security number, whatever, credit card number, those kind of things. So then you will give a pattern about the consumer pattern, but without the individual person's information.
Okay, does anybody have any thoughts on this?
Okay, that's my point.
Go ahead.
Very fast. Yeah, so I think this is a fantastic idea. I've been working with colleagues to sort of try to get something like this, a third-party institute that would be an interface between the platforms and the researchers. That would be exactly kind of what you're talking about, a place to deposit the data. And I think that would solve a lot of problems in terms of how we do science, and also in terms of, it would be very helpful for the platforms as well. I think it's a fantastic idea. The one thing I'll just throw out there that's slightly different from genetic data is that some of the problem with the social media data is that getting the PII, the personal identifying information, out of it is much more complicated than just removing the name and the social security number, because people post pictures of themselves and say, look, here I am with my kid, and they post pictures of their friends and they put their friends' names on it and things like that. So unfortunately, I don't think it's that simple. I think we have to worry about the front end a lot too, which is how we get access to people who will have access to this data. But there's really, really interesting work being done in this regard by people like Maggie Levinson at the ICPSR at University of Michigan, who's working on the idea of data passports, where you could have, you'd have to pass all sorts of certifications to get access to different levels of data sets with security, as well as the safe harbors that I was talking about before as another option.
Okay. And do you want to go ahead, both of you, and then we'll wrap, because I promised somebody we'd end at 12:10 exactly, and we're already a minute over.
2 seconds. The one thing that it's going to be interesting to see how this actually all evolves. And I think the marketplace is not, well, it would be a marketplace in essence because there would be a payment done for that data in the depository. But one of the interesting things is, like you said, that eliminates the moat. And so, well, yes, you can say, okay, I've got a dollar price to say, and they'll bring some incumbents are going to have to stave off the newcomers that come in, but none of these existing, like I said, data industrial complex are going to want to give up that moat that they've built and spent billions of dollars of shareholder money on building out that moat. And so the question is, who's going to actually affect this? Who's going to put it into play?
I'll just add that earlier in the conversation, Chris brought up open data, which is happening in governments all around the world. New York City has been a pioneer in this. And your idea, what you mentioned, could be imagined as flowing into some of these platforms that already allow the world, the community, to access data. I think the points about anonymity are very spot on, which is that no matter how much we strip off, it's hard to be sure that somebody can't be re-identified. And so difficult for a government or any entity to want to take on that liability. I think that's just something that you're going to run into with the idea. Something that I'm more and more interested in is how do we empower individuals with their own data? Because then you're not dealing with that issue. Somebody has the right to their own data. It doesn't have to be de-identified for me to learn about the data that my own actions on Facebook or my own health records. I have access to those. And then I can make choices. I can make choices about where to share those. So it removes that liability issue and the concerns about re-identification, and especially if you can take all of that data, give it to a person, and then create tools that allow them to actually choose which pieces are appropriate to share with which counterparties, whether those be family members, whether those be social media platforms, whether they be doctors. And so I think conceptually, that's where I expect us to head. Unfortunately, I don't think we're all that close to that world. So we'll see where it goes from here.
And do you have anything to add, or is it? I'll give you the last word if you want it.
Thank you very much. Look, for me, I think what all of this debate highlights is that there's a lot of this is a political question as much as a technology question, and so I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to bridge that gap between the people who understand the technology and the science and the people who are wrestling with the political leadership questions. And if we get that done, then I think we might make a bit of progress.
Okay, and on that note, I want to thank my panelists for giving their time for this, and to thank you all for being a terrific, terrific audience with wonderful questions. Thank you.